Hi, welcome to the Education Policy Equation. My name is Jack Murdoch, and my guest today is Dr. Lori Taylor. Dr. Taylor is head of the Department of Public Service and Administration, and Joe R. and Teresa Lozano Long, chair of Business and Government at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Dr. Taylor is a hugely respected researcher in the field of economics of education, and our topic today is efficiency and charter schools. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for being on the program.
Well, it's a great honor to be invited to talk with you today.
Absolutely. So I guess I'd like to begin by asking a two-part question that I think is pretty important to any conversation around charter schools. And that's firstly, what is a charter school? And secondly, what is the argument given by charter advocates for why charter schools are effective at promoting student academic achievement?
Okay. A charter school is a public school that has been established by charter, which means it has no geographic footprint. It doesn't have attendance zones or boundaries of the nature. It exists as a deregulated form of public school. Parents don't pay tuition. Many of the performance accountability characteristics of a traditional public school also apply to a charter school. So they are a deregulated charter school. They can make independent decisions about the structure of employee compensation, about the hiring and credentials of their personnel. They can choose curriculum models that are different from everybody else's. They can operate in multiple cities, whereas a traditional public school will only operate in a particular taxing jurisdiction.
Yeah, so along that line of taxes, I guess funding is another important topic. What is the differences in funding? How are charter schools funded versus how are public schools funded? Are they both paid on a per pupil basis? And in terms of how much do they get? Are they similar amounts, or do charters typically receive less?
Well, it depends from state to state. The funding formulas are state policy. And so some states are going to have different ways that they fund charter schools from others. Typically, a charter school is funded on an enrollment or average daily attendance basis in some way that is linked to the state's funding formula for schools that serve those populations. So in Texas, for example, the state funding formula provides additional revenue to a school district if they serve economically disadvantaged students. Charter schools also receive that same sort of premium for serving economically disadvantaged students. And so there is kind of a baseline per pupil revenue to the charter school that is similar to kind of the state average baseline per pupil revenue to a traditional public school. In some states, there are other additional factors that influence what kind of funding a charter school would receive. In Texas, for example, a traditional public school will receive some additional support if it is unusually small, because there's a perception that it's small by necessity, that there aren't enough people in rural parts of the state to get to an optimally sized school district. So they're going to be dysfunctionally expensive to operate in rural areas. So there's a premium for small districts. There's not really that same sort of support for small charter schools because they are typically operating in metropolitan areas and they are perceived as being small by choice. They decide how many students they're going to admit in any given year. A traditional public school admits every kid that lives in the attendance zone.
Absolutely. And then similarly, what are the differences in student demographics between charter schools and neighboring traditional public schools?
And again, that really depends on the nature of the state policy and the nature of the charter. There are some charter schools that are set up as essentially elite academies designed to prepare students for college education. There are other charter schools that are essentially designed to serve at-risk youth, students that have been identified as at risk of dropping out. These alternative education program campuses can be very different from a traditional education campus. So some charter schools will serve very targeted niche populations. That this charter school will have an Afrocentric curriculum, and that's the student body that they're trying to attract. Other schools will be an alternative education program or dropout prevention programs. And so they attract the students who fit that profile. This makes it really complicated when you want to talk about whether charter schools are more effective or less effective, or more efficient or less efficient than traditional public schools, because you can't compare them without a consideration of the student populations that they serve.
Yeah, absolutely. So, do we have any research on the differences in effectiveness of maybe these alternative education campuses that are charter schools versus public schools, and how they affect student performance for at-risk students?
Right. So I've done some work in Texas. So this is the Texas experience. Texas is one of the states where a lot of the charter schools are targeting students at risk of dropping out of traditional public schools. So these are kids that are already challenged, already having trouble passing standardized tests required for grade promotion, for example. So the at-risk population is disproportionately served by charter schools in Texas. And those charter schools have some very good charter schools and some not so great charter schools. On average, the student performance is roughly similar when you compare an at-risk alternative education charter school to an at-risk alternative education traditional public school. The outcomes, the performance metrics are ballpark similar. What's really different is that the charter schools get there with substantially less funding than the traditional public schools.
Yeah. So, do you have theories about what's driving the increased efficiency of the alternative education charter schools? You said they're getting to these similar performance marks, but with less resources. What do you think is driving that?
Well, I mean, there's basically three things that schools spend money on. There's kind of the personnel, there's the buildings, the infrastructure, and then there's things like programming and supplies and materials, electric bills, that sort of thing. What seems to be the biggest differences are in the facilities. Charter schools typically don't own their building, they rent, so they pay rent. So off the top of their expenses, they're paying for rent. A traditional public school will occupy a building that was paid for by the taxpayers through some sort of bond initiatives, possibly many years ago. Okay, so there's an expense that the charter schools incur, the traditional public schools do not. That should make them less efficient. They have more money they have to pay on the books. Most accounting systems don't ask a traditional public school to account for what they could have otherwise rented the building for if they didn't occupy it as a school. The opportunity cost of the building is not accounted for properly in traditional public schools. And yet we still see that even though they pay for rent, the charter schools are more cost efficient or more cost effective than the traditional public schools in serving the alternative education populations. It seems to be a twofold adjustment on the personnel side. Charter schools tend to operate larger class sizes, so they hire fewer school personnel. Charter schools also tend not to pay a premium for, or as large a premium for, a teacher with a master's degree compared to a teacher who doesn't have a master's degree, or a teacher with many years of experience compared to a teacher with 3 or 4 years of experience. Okay, so they are paying a smaller premium for some teacher characteristics, and they are hiring fewer teachers per student in the charter school. So both of those are bringing their personnel costs way down. without having a negative impact, a measurable negative impact on student performance. One of the other things that we suspect is a little bit has to do with the way that traditional public schools spend more on extracurriculars that don't like sports teams, athletics activities that are demonstrably effective at attaching kids to the school, getting kids to come to high school, is because I'm on the football team and I want to play. But it also is expensive. And charter schools typically don't have those athletic programs that traditional public schools, even alternative education oriented traditional public schools, can have.
Yeah. So I can easily imagine someone hearing that and thinking, so charter schools don't pay people extra for a master's degree. And well, wouldn't a master's degree be a signal of more human capital? These teachers have gone to school longer. They presumably should know more about teaching and be better teachers. So why would it make sense for charter schools not to pay a premium for extra education like a master's degree?
Well, we have about 20 years, maybe more like 30 years of research to date, asking what teacher characteristics are most effective in the classroom in terms of measured growth in student performance. And what the research tells you is that there's not that much more effective, or you don't get much better as a teacher with a master's degree. If you have a master's degree in a specific subject, you might have better content knowledge of that subject. But generically, a master's degree doesn't make you a better teacher. We all know, if we're going to university, that there are PhDs that can't teach their way out of a paper bag. Just because you've got an advanced degree doesn't necessarily mean that you're more effective in the classroom. And yet the salary structure for a lot of traditional public schools pays a large premium for having that master's degree. The other thing that the literature has told us is teachers matter enormously, but master's degrees won't really matter. And once you get out of the rookie shakedown cruise part of your career, additional years of experience don't translate into massive gains in your ability to teach. Very beginning teachers are not as effective in the classroom as more experienced teachers. But once you get 4 or 5 years of experience under your belt, you're pretty good at it. And if you stay in the classroom, you don't over time keep getting that much better, but you do keep getting that much more expensive because of the way that traditional salary structures pay a premium for years of experience.
Yeah. So on that note of salary structures, what is the difference in salary structures between um, traditional public schools and charter schools? I mean, we've seen that they don't pay a premium for master's degrees and but as a career as a teacher, what would it look like in a charter school versus a traditional public school?
And again, I have to reemphasize that there's a lot of variation in the charter schools, and there's a lot of variation from state to state. Most of my work is done using Texas data. Now, Texas is big, and it represents about 1/12 of the nation. And so a lot of what's going on in Texas is reflected nationwide. But what you see is that the charter schools tend to are more likely to use some sort of pay for performance structure where the compensation of teachers depends on the academic accomplishments of students, and less likely to have a rigid salary structure that steps up with each additional year of experience or each additional degree that a faculty member has under their belt.
Absolutely. And moving on to the class size aspect, it's pretty intuitive, I feel like, for a lot of people to imagine that smaller class sizes are really important, and it makes sense that you, on the surface level at least, that you would want more teacher student attention, which a small class size brings. Um, why do you think charter schools are able to maintain the academic performance levels of traditional public schools while at the same time increasing class size?
There's a clear literature out there that tells you that there are important differences between truly small class sizes and truly large class sizes, but not a whole lot of differences kind of in the middle of the range. Going from a class size of 20 to a class size of 22 is not a huge difference in the learning experience of a student. Whereas going from a class size of 10 to a class size of 20 would be huge. So what typically happens in smaller schools is you're going to wind up with a classroom that is got that could easily accommodate an additional student without any particular increase in cost and without any loss of the instructional fidelity, without any loss of the teacher being able to engage with all the students. Because we're not talking about charter schools running average class sizes that are huge. We're just talking about them running them systematically larger than traditional public schools.
Yeah. I guess now I'd like to go towards in Texas, where you've done your research. What is the sort of distribution of charter schools geographically? Are they do they tend to cluster in urban areas, or are they more rural? And if there is a difference, is there a difference in the effectiveness of rural versus urban charters in Texas?
There are very few rural charters, and some of those are residential charters, meaning that the students live there. So they can be associated with a residential program of some sort. And so most of the charter schools in Texas are located in a metropolitan area. And that's because that's where you will find a large enough population of students who will be interested in enrolling in a charter school, such that you can operate the charter school in a more cost-effective kind of manner. Choice is a solution that works well in metropolitan areas, not necessarily a wonderful solution for sparsely populated rural areas, because you're going to wind up with an extremely expensive to operate very small school, and all of the increased costs associated with operating a school that is incredibly small.
Absolutely. Now, on the notion of choice, there, one argument for charter schools is that having a lot of these smaller schools will sort of put some competition into the education market, and it will sort of force traditional public schools to maybe work harder to improve educational outcomes for students, and in general, it'll just foster sort of uh, more competitive drive for results.
Mm-hmm.
What are your intuitions on how that plays out? Do charters play a significant role in that? Is that at all a true phenomenon that these charter schools do foster competition?
Well, I think that they do foster competition. I think that competition leads to greater efficiency and greater responsiveness. But there's a trade-off here, which is that there are economies of scale in education. Bigger school, but still only one principal. You've got enormous administrative savings, but also you have savings at the classroom level, because you're with a very small school, you're running a sixth grade classroom that only has 14, 15 students in it. When it would be much more cost effective if you were a bigger district, you could divvy up the kids in a way that every school would have, classroom would have, say, 20 kids in it. And that would be much more cost effective to operate it that way. So smaller is expensive. And so there are economies of scale in education. If you try to have a lot of competition and it's too small, the schools themselves are too small, you can drive up costs. So you need a certain critical mass. On the other hand, your school district doesn't have to be all that large to be able to completely exhaust all the economies of scale, such that getting a little bit bigger isn't going to save you anything. And those are the sweet spots where having more competition can be really desirable. So when the districts are big enough to have largely taken advantage of the economies of scale, but other charter schools or other traditional public schools that offer a different package of classroom opportunities and instructional curriculum and all those kinds of things mean that you have to be responsive to parent needs. You have to be more responsive to student needs. All that competition tends to have a positive impact on efficiency, keeps people's eyes on the ball, keeps them using their resources in more cost-effective ways. Once you're big enough that the economies of scale aren't the issue. So again, you have to be big enough that you have decision-making authority over a school where you can choose optimally sized and optimally expensive classrooms. Small schools, competition, trying to break things up or make things smaller or divide up into charters and traditional public schools in sparsely populated neighborhoods just cost you too much in terms of the loss of economies of scale. But once you get to a metropolitan area, Texas-sized metropolitan area, which can be a couple 100,000, maybe 50,000 population, you can get to the school systems are big enough to where the real kick is on the competition side.
Absolutely. And on the economies of scale note, what are the differences in Texas in who runs charter schools? Are these local freestanding charters, or are they charter management organizations in Texas that are allowed to operate multiple charter schools?
And again, because of that heterogeneity, that difference across all the different charter schools, some of them are run by very large charter management organizations like IDEA or Yes Prep or KIPP. And others are very much a locally homegrown one or two, single charter with maybe 3 or 4 campuses kind of structures.
Do we see differences in efficiency between large charter management organizations and local freestanding charters? Is there any literature on that?
I am not confident in being able to say that it's the charter management organizations. Clearly, one of the problems you run into with a charter management organization in terms, one of the analytic problems is you don't know how the shared costs should be attributed to the various charter school campuses. If you have some organization like KIPP that operates multiple charters in multiple cities, and they have a single marketing and advertising budget, which they use broadly, how do you attribute that back to the campuses as a cost of each of the individual charters or each of the individual schools? It just becomes much more complex in terms of making sure you're measuring all of the costs of operation. If you've got a central administration that is across multiple charters, where are you going to attribute for want of a better word, the superintendent's salary? Where are you going to attribute the substitute teachers? And so it's a very complex problem to try and get at this charter management organizations issue.
Yeah. Do you have any notions about the differences between school accountability is a term that's thrown around a lot. It's really popular within the school reform movement. Is accountability will force schools to become better and serve the needs of students and parents more. Do you have any ideas about what the differences between charter schools and traditional public schools are with respect to accountability, if there are any differences?
And again, it differs from state to state. In Texas, the charter schools and the traditional public schools are required to provide the same nature of their financial accountability to let people see their checkbook and see how they're spending their money. Students are required to take the same set of state level standardized tests. The accountability structure is largely the same with one exception, which is some of the charter schools are small enough that they don't cross the statistical thresholds required for having reliable average performance measures. And so they don't wind up reporting on all their subgroup student populations, or they have a total performance, but not broken down by African American versus Hispanic students, because they don't have enough of any one population to maintain student confidentiality. So to that extent, small schools, whether they're charter or traditional public school, don't have the same intensity of accountability as the larger schools, where they have enough populations, enough kids in every category to be required to report on every category. And that produces a lot more information and holds them accountable, not just for the whole, but also for the parts.
Absolutely. So, in Texas, what does the future of charter schools look like? Are we seeing charter schools expanding even more and more in Texas? Are they increasingly staying urbanized? What is the growth of charter schools in Texas look like in the next few years?
I think that the likely form of growth will be that existing charter schools will expand to open additional campuses, potential additional campuses in additional cities. I think that they are likely to stay where the population density is high enough for the charter schools to be able to operate with economies of scale. I think that the charter schools are starting to become some such fully fleshed out with respect to grade levels. A lot of charter schools we're going to start with kindergarten, and then next year we'll have kindergarten in first grade, and the year after that we'll have kindergarten first and second. And charter schools have been around in Texas long enough that those that wish to serve K-12 are serving K-12 now. And so you have some charters that only serve high school students, some that only serve elementary school students, some that only serve at-risk kids, some that only serve college prep kids, one that only serves gymnasts. So there's a lot of variation there. What's likely to happen is that the successful charter schools will start opening more and more campuses, not that there will be a whole lot of new charter operators in the state.
Gotcha. So one last question for you. In Texas, do you see charter schools as being a positive force for improving student educational outcomes? Are there dangers to the charter school movement, or do you think it's probably a good thing for your state?
Well, my own personal perspective is that charter schools provide choice to parents who didn't have much before, that they are most effective when there's really good information so that the parents can make an informed choice about which schools they should enroll their kids at. I think that the charter schools are serving populations that weren't necessarily well served by the traditional public schools. I think they have created a competitive environment in some of the cities that have led to adoption of practices that make the total school system better. The the important things about charter schools, to my mind, are that they make it possible for students to find a better fit. If the high school that their house is attached to is not the best fit for them, it doesn't have the kind of programming they want, a charter school is a very viable cost attractive alternative for a family. One of the things that allows for is customization within a family. So if you've got 2 kids or 3 kids, and one of them is extremely well served by the traditional public school system, they can stay. And the other kid can be served by a charter school, and you don't have to move your house in order to be able to get a better match for your child's educational needs. And that's very attractive. It's important that the state continues to have accountability, that whenever you have the public paying for education, the state has a right to know whether it's getting its money's worth. And so I think it's crucially important that you do have the accountability elements of Texas when you're thinking about whether the charter schools are on net a positive or on net a negative. My own take is that they've been on net a positive, but that doesn't mean that every charter school is wonderful or every traditional public school is lame. There are some amazing traditional public schools, and there are some amazing charter schools in the state.
Absolutely. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's been an honor to have you.
I appreciate the invitation.